We handle a fair amount of coal. We handle a lot of grain on the line. We've been able to develop, in partnership with ADM and other grain haulers, a good working relationship where we've built the grain traffic up from approximately 600 cars in '89 when we took over to 9,000 carloads last year, and we're looking forward to next year being even better. That is, of course, based on the fact that grain harvest stays steady, and we have the typical market reaction to the Russian grain sales and things like that. I think we're well positioned. We're on the river. We have barge traffic to the Gulf, where the grain ships leave from. And we have a processor on our line. Archer Daniel Midland runs a processor in Peoria. So we've been able to focus our attention on selling traffic for the TPW.
In 1837, the Illinois legislature appropriated money for what was to become the tp&w Railroad. The railroad was first chartered as the Toledo, Peoria, and Warsaw Railroad. One of the first locomotives on the line was a 440 manufactured by Latham and O.M. Works. A number of twin-stack engines made their appearance early on. This was the first number 3. Number 6, another twin-stack, was also purchased early on. This Rogers-built 280 was the second number 7. And here's number 7 once more, but ready for the scrapper. The first number 5, a 440, was built with 60-inch drivers. The railroad built quite a number of stations along the line over the years. But this one at Chatsworth brings back memories of one of the worst railroad wrecks in the United States.
He said he put out the fire, but some of his section men said he didn't. I suppose he perhaps did what he usually did. Oh, put 2 or 3 shovels of dirt on it and expect that to take care of it. It would have ordinarily, but the wind came up that night and blew sparks and set weeds afire, and they burned over and burned under the underpinnings of the bridge, and the whole thing was just ready to collapse. The first engine made it across by momentum. Second engine went down and turned over, and the engineer was killed. In fact, the railroad was driven into bankruptcy. The people got really rather small amounts. I think someplace I read it was an average of $600 person that was injured or killed, which is a minimal amount, but it was all the railroad could pay. But they went bankrupt in the process. At the time that I wrote this book, The Train That Never Arrived, I had the most, and I'm not bragging, but I had the most information of any living person, because I had interviewed, I had read every article that I could get my hands on.
By 1928, the TP&W had well established itself in East Peoria. Construction continued on a roundhouse and turntable during these early years. Watseka, Illinois was a bustling metropolis, and the town provided good revenue from farmers to the TPW. The Fulton County Narrow Gauge Railroad crossed the TPW here. Note the stub switch. This 440 was the first number 11 built by Danforth. The second number 10 was built by Rogers in 1898 and lasted on the roster until the late 20s. Number 15 was built by Baldwin and purchased new by the TPW. The lines of these consolidation-type locos were clean and established a precedence to the 80-class engines years later. The first of the 20-class engines had the Pennsylvania Railroad as their heritage. The 40 series Class H6 engines were built by Alco and were the first Mikados on the TPW roster. Number 3 was also a 280. Number 40 steps across the bridge over the Illinois River. Here we see the 40 again. The 40 series engines were built in 1927. Number 42 poses at East Peoria for a fine sunlit photograph. The 43 was the last in the 40 class locos built for the TPW. George P. McNear, the TPW president, had been embattled with the railroad unions for some time. He began reducing wages and benefits and never lived up to his promise to restore those wages. The railroad was taken over by Uncle Sam. In the meantime, McNear tried to regain control. The Brotherhood of Locomotive Enginemen and Firemen strongly resisted McNear again taking control. Executive Order 9572 was issued by President Truman in June 1945, ordering the return of the railroad to McNear. McNear wrote Truman, explaining he was going to raise pay to TPW employees, but he never did. McNear had previously been in hot water with the government back in 1942 and was the first one indicted for trying to scare employees to not vote union ways. Eventually, workers fearing for their jobs would not testify against McNear, and he was acquitted in the coercion charge. The railroad issued a statement regarding compliance with the new government laws in 1945, but the unions were not impressed. McNear began hiring armed guards to allow continuation of railroad operation. Killings began as far back as 1941, and considerable destruction and derailments also came about during this violent period. Residents of the area began complaining of the armed camp in their area. On February 6, 1946, 2 pickets were killed and 3 wounded. An armed train passed through Gridley, and shots were fired into the pickets. 4 guards were arrested, placed on trial, and released. There were never any indictments. Here, 2 employees posed by a strike shack next to bullet holes, shown by the arrow. It was said that 25 to 30 guns were taken from the armored train at Gridley. The armored train included a locomotive, cars, and caboose fitted with bulletproof steel. Remnants of the bulletproofing still remained years later. The thickness of the steel offered proof that these were no games being played with small arms fire. McNear rubbed more salt in the wounds of union leaders with his articles on feather bedding on the railroads, and the strike went on. Pickets were a frequent sight along the railroad, and this group stood in the freezing weather, resolved to stand up to McNear. Undaunted by the unions, McNear himself switched cars on the line and made sure the newspapers caught account of his actions. No matter where one looked, the evidence of the strike was everywhere. But little or no freight was being picked up. Union men would not load or unload cars on the TPW. More bullet holes. These in the car of Irwin Passion, a troublemaker at Union Station and the East Peoria yards. Strikers appeared in all kinds of garb, including suits, ties, and hats. This cartoon depicted Uncle Sam's willingness to run the railroad without McNear. Harry Truman went on national radio to end the strike on the TPW and other roads. And as he was giving his speech, he was handed a note stating the strike had been settled.
And the 20 different railroad unions. I've been doing the same with respect to the pending labor dispute in the coal mine. Time and again,
reporters rushed to their phones to turn in the story, almost like the old Hollywood movies. But time had run out for McNear. and on March 10, 1947, at 10:40 p.m., while taking his nightly walk, McNear was shot to death near his home on Moss Avenue in Peoria. Thus ends one of the most bitter strikes in railroad recorded history. McNear was known for some fine innovations in locomotives. John Buckingham tells us about those beautiful Northerns.
They never told me about when you built a fire in a steam engine that if you left the hole in the firebox, you didn't cover all the grates with the coal, well, you'd get a terrible rumble and all this, but they did brief me on make sure it had plenty of water in the boiler. You know, they briefed me on all that stuff, but they never. So the first one I lit was on engine 85. And of course, as soon as I lit it started rumbling and vibrating, so I ran to my supervisor, and everybody in the roundhouse seemed to knew what was wrong with it but myself. But this was, to me, it was quite shocking because, you know, I thought, you know, they told me you have to be careful with the water, and I thought, well, we've got a boiler that's going to go up, you know. So I went and told him, and he said, well, you've got a hole in the firebox. Then I went mostly to, we was taking the jackets off when we still had steam engines. That was a job, and then I helped the boilermakers leg the boilers. That was, and I helped drive stay bolts in the firebox.
John also explained the problems he had with a tire on engine number 42.
So I went out there with a machinist, and I'm thinking all the way out there, a tire slipping on a steam engine, you know. So what happened if they did much slippage? Well, that would heat up the rim, and then the shims, those were shims, and that wheel would work off the wheel. So we got out there, and I thought, well, how are we gonna, you know? So we drove shims in that, and then we sledgehammered the tire back over in place. In 1980, we had the 765. That was an engine from the Indiana that they were bringing down and having rides on, and I got an opportunity to work on that. And that was because then we were all diesel. And that was quite an experience because we still had some stuff left over from the old steam engine days, because the difference between steam engines and the diesel end of it, I found out that we made most of the stuff for the steam engines, and the diesels was like a parts department.
Logos were always being changed over the years on the TP&W. Let's take a look at some of those logos that developed over the years.
My memories first was of the steam engine. Everything was steam in 1947. Was as a telegraph operator at weighing about 135 pounds and only 5'7", standing up at a mark on a platform, holding a train order fork in the air, passing on messages to a speeding steam engine as they went by. And this object that I have in my hand is referred to as a train order fork. Usually the one for the engine had a little longer handle, and this one that I have, I would imagine, was more suitable for the caboose. I mean, for the reaching. It was really very simple, but the device worked so well and was almost flawless. The bamboo sticks in here allowed for the spring action, and the string that was put in here was tied in a certain way. The messages, we had a slip knot that would open like this. The messages, train orders would be put in here, and this would be pulled down on them. And then, of course, when the train came, especially if you were at an outlying station, they didn't stop. The through trains kept right on coming through. And before we got train order racks where these were put into a stationary rack that held them, why, that was just you and the train and the elements out there. You were always concerned of coal or something falling off of those engines. But these 80 class engines, they were a beautiful engine, and the horn that was on that was a deep, mellow sound. And when you heard the old 80, you could hear it crying across the prairie at night, and that sound seemed to have kind of a magnetism that just held you because it was such a mellow, deep, warm sound. So while the railroad, the steam engine was really, still is, holds a lot of awe for the young people that have never seen a steam engine, a big steam engine run. They're almost scary the first few times you see them come steaming and huffing through. The diesels started to coming out around in '49, that the TP&W was starting to get a mix of diesel. The diesel did have an awful lot of advantage. The track didn't have to be maintained near as good as with the steam. The steam engine, the track had to be in good shape.
Marilyn Clark Paxson is the daughter of Leo Clark. Leo Clark's life was written up in local newspapers, and Mrs. Paxson tells us a bit about how Leo became so well known and liked.
My dad was 16 when he quit going to high school. His grandfather had gotten him a job on the Wabash, a summer job, was supposed to be. But then he was offered a job as a fireman, and he decided not to return to that last year of school. He found that after 2 years, he could be transferred to the TP&W and be an engineer. So at 21, he was the youngest engineer in the United States. Dad was a freight engineer most of his life. He said he didn't like the responsibility of passengers, always afraid something would happen. I believe it's true that he never did. He might have been in accidents, but he never did kill anybody. From an early age, he always said 10 years old. Dad loved to take pictures. He actually took his camera on the engine, and I'm told has the largest collection of pictures of the TP&W equipment of anyone in the country. In '49, the TP&W bought new diesel engines. Dad was proud that he was the only engineer that only needed one trip with the instructor before he'd mastered it. The diesels did improve the service and the conditions the men worked under.
Photographer Hewlin Cross had some great tales to tell about TP&W passenger trains.
And I recall the trains being, well, pulled, of course, by an American-type engine, a 440, and a baggage car and a passenger car, or perhaps two passenger cars, but that was the limit of what I saw. And quite often it was just a two-coach train, a baggage car and a passenger car. I remember in later years riding, not too many years later, riding over to La Hogue, and apparently they were pulling a Chicago and Alton coach, Chicago-bound, behind the TP&W train, which we left at Chenoa. The three of us had all obtained movie cameras. We got into movies, 8mm home movies at that time. And if you remember in the film, that engine is doing some switching down there, and it had a scale car coupled on the front end, a small four-wheel car that I think they used to test scales with. It was a weighted car, and then it had a couple of other cars coupled onto it.
Like most railroads, the TP&W had its share of wrecks and natural calamities. Here, two locos hit head-on, causing some significant damage to the front ends of each. Floods along the Illinois River caused a great deal of consternation for this locomotive crew. Steam locos need water, but not this much. But where are the tracks? And two more locos have an unplanned cornfield meet. Sometimes, wrecks only created little problems, such as the re-railing of this reefer with a large crane. Other times, fatalities were involved. This engine struck a herd of cattle, derailed, and the fireman was killed. Earl Franks was a witness to one of the worst railroad explosions and wrecks on any railroad in the U.S. He describes the disaster at Crescent City.
At that time, Crescent City was the first LP gas explosion, hazardous material explosion that railroads had experienced in this country. And very few people, if any, knew how to handle it. We had Chanute Field there, we had fire departments, and nobody really knew what to do with it. And so it was quite an experience, and we rebuilt the town. Our insurance company did, I should say. I think at that time it was $2 million, which was a lot of money back in 1970.
Fire departments in the area were called when a number of propane tank cars derailed near downtown Crescent City on June 21st, 1970. This was the first propane tank car derailment in the U.S., and firefighters knew little about containing the fire. Most of the town had been evacuated once the fire and police departments assumed the worst. Those who remained were police, fire, and news people, including WCIA TV news photographer Vern Belt, who captured these amazing scenes. The first explosion sent debris from the tank cars rocketing into town, setting some buildings on fire and leveling others close to the derailment. Huge sections of tank cars were sent hundreds of feet into the town. Sections of tank cars were literally buried into the ground from the force of the initial explosions. And more of the town is set on fire. The devastation appears similar to a nuclear bomb. Most of the downtown area of Crescent City was leveled. And then in July 1 of 1980, we had negotiated with all the unions
the ICG, and we started Amtrak from East Peoria to Chicago. Ran from East Peoria to Shinoa, onto the IC trackage, and then into Union Station, Chicago, up in the morning and back at evening. And that lasted for 1 year, and then Amtrak pulled the train because of lack of ridership.
Bill Lankson was quite familiar with the long-forgotten practice of icing refrigerator cars.
Well, the ice house was a beehive of activity because perishable freight was one of our big sellers as far as getting business from California to New York and the eastern markets. And we maintained good schedules, and when the trains came into the yard with the perishable freight, and those that needed icing had to be switched out, and it was mayhem for about 3 hours around that yard until everything was switched out, all the cars were iced and back in the train, and the air run, and the train would be on its way to the old Pennsylvania. But it was a busy place. It was very interesting, but we had quite an operation down there. It was well run, and the plant was maintained well, and I don't know of any ice plant anywhere that could ice cars and get them on the road as fast as the tp&w. We had a dog named Blackie, and he was just an old hobo of a dog. He was several varieties, and he was a good dog. If he liked you, you had no problems, but every once in a while he'd take a notion to just not like someone. One of the switchmen on the railroad couldn't seem to get along with Blackie either, and he would chase him around a little bit. Well, somebody finally said something about, well, if the switchman has to go, or Blackie, I think the switchman ought to go.
True to form for most railroads, specialized equipment was constructed from existing engines. In this case, the TPW had an A and a B unit, and the B unit would be down if the A unit were disabled. EMD said a B unit could not be rebuilt into an A unit, and the TPW mechanics said baloney and went about proving EMD wrong. First, one end was cut down, exposing the frame. Then a skeleton framework was built up over the future nose end. Then followed the skin, expertly wrapped around the nose, followed by cab windows. Finally, the diesel engine itself was rebuilt, all in the TPW shops. Robert McMillan became president of the TPW in 1977 and faced the daunting task of reversing declining traffic.
You know, I came down from the Santa Fe in the fall of 1977 to be president when Charlie Patterson retired. And I told my wife before we left Chicago that from everything I could see, I was going to be the last president.
Bob McMillan also discussed the deteriorating track and the loss of the Illinois River Bridge.
We also had a barge strike the Illinois River Bridge in 1970 and knocked it out of service. And our freight trains have been detouring ever since that time. Now, I say 1970. They've been detouring over the P&PU because of the inoperable bridge. We looked very closely at the economies of restoring that bridge to service. It was a swing span, as you'll recall. And we had bridge tenders around the clock down there. And it was obvious that short of building an entire new bridge, which was economically out of the question, that the only rational thing to do was to rebuild the structure as it had been, as a swing span. And we would still have had to staff it with bridge tenders around the clock, and the dollars just weren't there. One of the interesting things that we accomplished was the inauguration of Amtrak service on the TP&W in 1980. We'd been discussing the possibility of passenger train service between East Peoria and Chicago with the state of Illinois and Amtrak for some time. In fact, there had been people in the Peoria area actively encouraging Amtrak service, even back to my days on the Santa Fe. I remember being involved with those discussions at the time because one of the proposals was to run passenger trains from the old Rock Island station site to Chicago using the Rock Island at Chillicothe and then getting up on the Santa Fe at Chillicothe and going into Chicago that way. But that wasn't feasible. The 18 miles on the Rock Island between between Peoria and Chillicothe were in deplorable condition. And the Rock Island wasn't enthusiastic about the project. They wanted, as I recall, some $18 million to rehabilitate the line. And I know that the Santa Fe wasn't excited about the idea, and it would have required the construction of an all-new connection in the southeast quadrant of the intersection of the two lines at Chillicothe. So when I came down here, while we started talking, because we would have been happy we were happy to have the train. I could see that it would be more jobs for TP&W train and enginemen. It would be a public benefit, and I could also see that there were some other advantages to the TP&W, and specifically we ended up having the state of Illinois fund the complete rehabilitation and reconstruction of the long siding at Kruger, and also the back lead over here at East Peoria. These were maintenance chores that were very important that we just couldn't afford to have done. But the state did that because we needed this work done in anticipation of running an Amtrak train. Well, we were able to work out the details with the state and with Amtrak and with the Illinois Central Gulf, the line from Chenoa to Chicago, so that service was inaugurated in August of 1980 with the understanding that on the part of the state of Illinois that it would be a use it or lose it proposition. But nevertheless, we ran that train for 14 months. The patronage never got to the level it was supposed to. But I'll say one thing, our train and engine crews did a excellent job. This is what the chart was that I used to keep in my office, Tom, and that merely was a chart showing the average number of overhead or intermediate traffic that I was talking to you about, one railroad to another per month. 1962, it was running 5,500 carloads a month, and you see, year by year, it went down. Here in 1977, it was down here less than 3,000 carloads a month, was 2,400 carloads in 78 per month, 2,500 in 79, 2,380. 1981 is when the Logansport was closed to through rates and routes. It was 1,600 cars. In 1982, it was 500 cars, and in 1983, it was 161 cars. That was the effect of the Staggers Act, and that's what caused the Santa Fe to decide to merge the two railroads. We were losing money month after month after month. We reduced as far as we could. And I refused to stop putting in ties and renewing rail where it has to be done, because then you start having, you get caught in a downward spiral. Once you stop putting ties in, you start having derailments, and when you start having derailments, your customers start going away, and your expenses build up, and people get hurt, and it's. We did what we could to keep going, and we just couldn't cut enough.
As the TPW moved into the diesel age, they acquired quite a number of new locomotives, and were particularly proud of the new F units. The railroad also began some mainline surgery by rebuilding the Route 24 underpass in East Peoria. The old viaduct at Washington, Illinois was long a traffic bottleneck. And the bridge was rebuilt over Peoria Street to allow more free auto traffic movement. By the late 40s, engine number 81 graced the viaduct over Route 24. The TPW jumped with all 4 feet into the diesel era, beginning with the F3 loco number 100. And here's the finished converted B unit, number 101. The first general-purpose freight diesels were GP7s, and numbers 102 through 103 made up this series. The TPW developed quite a number of different paint schemes over the years, and here is the 103 in another garb. And we finally end up with the color shot of the 103. Engines 200 through 206 were RS2s, delivered in 1948 and 49. In 1972, the TPW purchased their only Alco RS3. The 300 series engines were built by both Lima and EMD. Then, in the late 50s, the 400 series went into service. These engines were Alco RS11s. This GP18 is the only engine in the 600 series. And the only engine in the 700 series is this GP30. Alco trucks from RS2s were fitted under this GP35 900 series engine. This GP40 was ex-EMD 21 and acquired by the TPW in 1959. It is the only engine in the 1000 series. 11 GP38-2s are in service under the 2000 series. GP30 number 700 had the distinct honor of being dressed up for the bicentennial anniversary. Cabooses came in all kinds of flavors over the years, and we present just a few samples for your review. Note the Santa Fe effect on some. The TPW built a number of stations, large and small. This one was located at Effner. At Hamilton, the train crew poses on the pilot of engine 16. A Class 80 engine roars by the Eureka Station and grain elevator. This station was located at La Harpe. The Washington Station was built of sturdy brick and was one of the nicest stations on the TPW. A quaint station sat at Bushnell. The TPW used the Peoria Union Station over the years. When Santa Fe trimmed branches in 1987, they sold the Peoria district of TPW to the tp&w Acquisition Corporation. Gordon Fuller was elected president under this new organization.
TPW has been mistreated under its past management, as far as I'm concerned. I'm speaking of the ownership by the Santa Fe. And I say mistreated, what I'm referring to is the fact that it was a division, a subdivision of a division, and it didn't get the kind of focus on marketing and sales that it needed to have. Unfortunately, the Santa Fe's vision was more toward the west rather than toward the Midwest, where TPW's focal point is. The TPW is really two railroads in one. It's an intermodal railroad that looks west for its intermodal traffic base, and it's an eastern railroad for most of the rest of its traffic. We handle a fair amount of coal. We handle a lot of grain on the line. We've been able to develop, in partnership with ADM and other grain haulers, a good working relationship where we've built the grain traffic up from approximately 600 cars in '89. We took over to 9,000 carloads last year, and we're looking forward to next year being even better. That is, of course, based on the fact that grain harvest stays steady, and we have the typical market reaction to the Russian grain sales and things like that.
The TP&W's main operations are located at East Peoria. Here one will find a variety of diesels, switching and maintenance, so common to any large railroad yard. The engine-ready track is located near the yard office. A turntable still exists in the yard and is used mainly to arrange engines in the proper direction. Near the yard office, we can also find the sanding and fueling facilities. Maintenance is a constant chore on any railroad, and here we see some trucks being degreased. The TPW also replaces their traction motors and wheels. The dropping and removing of the traction set is quite an interesting operation. Peoria yard also hosts a small intermodal operation. Also located at the yard is the dispatch office. Car and train operations are controlled from here. Many train operations are at night, and as a result, nighttime yard activity is always a bustling affair. Let's take a ride west from East Peoria across the Illinois River to Iowa Junction. The Hustler will bring the engine up for the mainline crew, and soon we'll be on our way. The Chicago and Northwestern shares trackage over the Pekin and Peoria Union Bridge, which crosses the Illinois River. This is Iowa Junction. We'll stay here for a while and wait for an eastbound local headed by 2008 as it meets westbound KCO-BY. Heading east from the East Peoria yard, we'll catch action all the way to Monticello, Indiana. We are at Washington, Illinois, at the Route 24 overpass. At Kruger, an eastbound local switches some cars at the grain elevator. At Eureka, we catch the same eastbound local. East of Eureka, a westbound coal train is making time toward East Peoria. West of El Paso, we catch a local heading westbound at Secor. At El Paso, another westbound coal struggles through town. At Gridley, we caught the same train as it rushed through town earlier in the day. The Southern Pacific crosses the TPW at Chenoa. Here, our local passes the station at the junction. At Fairbury, we climb aboard the cab for the rest of our run east to Monticello. Norfolk Southern crosses the TPW east of Forest.
Get so busy to have the double trackers. I'd like to see you guys get so busy with this intermodal stuff that you have to double track it.
Yeah.
Get it up to, what, 79 mile an hour standard?
Really, that'd be nice to do.
How's the intermodal business? Pick up quite a bit?
Yeah, it was doing pretty good. I don't know what it's about the same. It picked up some.
Chatsworth is the next town east. Here we'll catch that westbound coal we saw earlier. At the east end of town, a historical marker has been placed near the highway commemorating the Chatsworth wreck of 1887. Our next town east is Piper City. The Illinois Central crosses the TPW at Gilman. There's a fine old station located here as well.
3 or 4 hours, I see. Why would you just don't run that much this way?
We depart from the train just long enough to catch an IC train heading northbound across the Diamond. East of town, a TPW caboose and the bell from engine 52 has been set up by Virgil Reeves on his farm adjacent to the tracks. We also found a fine collection of old lanterns, models of TPW engines, timetables, and prints displayed in the basement of John Bradle. Tom Finson cannot help but admire the slow order lamp owned by Virgil Reeves. We leave our local and jump over to the Hoosier Lift west of Reynolds. Signs advertise the intermodal facility as you travel along Interstate 65. Hoosier Lift is small compared to huge facilities such as Santa Fe's Corwith Yard, but the activity is easier to watch and just as captivating. Typical action during both night and day includes loading and unloading trailers. Note the operator's dog helping out. Videographer Steve Neff began capturing shots of the TP&W in the summer of 1992. During a beautiful summer day, he caught action at Monticello, Indiana, of a westbound local crossing the Indiana Bridge. The local then crossed the CSX at Monticello. And shortly, the local was again spotted at Reynolds crossing the Union Pacific. By the way, if you catch action at East Peoria, take a side trip to Morton, south of East Peoria, and locate the Farmdale Trestle. If you're lucky, you just might catch a train. President Fuller sums up the course of action for the future of the TP&W.
We want to be the sort of the all-weather, short route, high-speed alternative to going through Chicago. And I believe some of those railroads are now looking at the congestion in Chicago again, especially winter months when the snow can get very difficult up there, and looking at TPW to get them as a route around Chicago. This is nothing new, it's nothing special. Peoria was always one of the alternative gateway cities for the railroad industry. If you look back in the history of Peoria, my God, there were 15 or 20 railroads that came through here. And what we're trying to do is say Peoria Gateway is again the way to be. We can offer a service package that's tailored to the needs of the Class 1 railroads, tailored to the needs of the customers, and hopefully that's the way we can move forward.